Hello plant lovers, it's Matthew in Melbourne in a sea of Phalaenopsis because it is now time to prematurely, but I will get to that, reveal the outcome of our great Phalaenopsis flower spike experiment. But first, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne without greenhouses or grow lights or heat mats or humidifiers, etc., etc. Complete amateur, struggling my way through understanding what I can grow. So if that's of any interest, I do post every week, so hit subscribe. So yes, the great Phalaenopsis flower spike experiment. Now, let me just recap. I did make a video introducing the experiment, which I will link up here. And the experiment was, in all of my Phalaenopsis growing life, which actually I've grown them, for over 10 years, I suppose, I have always cut the flower spikes off the minute the last flower has dropped, regardless of whether it was still really green or whether it had already started to dry off and go brown and look dead. But I was visiting a friend in Hobart in Tasmania here in Australia, and he's a great orchid grower, and he just had endless sequential blooms from his Phalaenopsis and said, no, I just leave the spike, and if it dies, it dies. If it doesn't, it keeps flowering. And I thought, interesting. And then one of my Phalaenopsis in bloom, the flowers dropped, the spike stayed green, and a new secondary spike started to appear. So I decided, plant lovers, here is a great chance for an experiment. Let's see how that one progresses versus a regular flower spike coming from the base of a plant anew. And it so happened that at the time I had a Phalaenopsis that was in spike, this one. I had the Phalaenopsis that had decided to grow a secondary spike, this one. And I had a Phalaenopsis that the flower spike had withered and gone brown, which I'd cut off, this one. But we were getting towards the conclusion of our experiment naturally when nature and the universe intervened, and look what happened. That, plant lovers, is what's known in the trade as a snapped spike. Now, this is not a culture of blame, but it wasn't me. Just saying. And it didn't snap because of the weight of the spike. It snapped because someone put undue pressure on this spike. Anyway, as I said, it's not a culture of blame. It doesn't matter. But anyway, there we are. All right, let's clear the decks and let's go plant by plant. All right. This is the plant that had this flower spike, and this was the one that, in fact, you can see it quite clearly now. So this was the old spike where all the flowers dropped off, and then I had the new growth appearing at one of the flower nodes. And it developed into quite a beautiful spike, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 open flowers, 1, 2, 3, 4 more buds, and still a growing tip. Although one bud, as you can see, had decided to blast. But anyway, we were going to have a great show. And my question was, one of the theories is that if you leave a spike to do this, that the subsequent flowers are perhaps not as big, not as vigorous, you won't get as many blooms as you did originally. But look, they are massive. They are really, really beautiful flowers and exactly the same size and the same quantity that I had on the original spike. So, despite the fact that someone viciously snapped this off, the result of this experiment is that this orchid has done extremely well with a second flowering from the old spike. So I've decided, plant lovers, that I'm going to let my orchids tell me what they want to do. And as this spike hadn't died and it produced this secondary growth, let it do what it wants to do. There we are. I'm still happy with the outcome, and I've learned a great deal about Phalaenopsis habits that I wouldn't have done if we hadn't have had this experiment. All right, but let's look at some of our other subjects. Now, this was the orchid that had the baby spike just emerging, and this is the one that, I don't know if you remember, had been eaten by a caterpillar. Heaven knows how the caterpillar managed to find its way inside. But anyway, so there you can see the spike is still growing and it's doing really well. But obviously, when it comes to speed, the existing spike of the previous orchid obviously bloomed sooner. So there you go. There is one factor to bear in mind, that you're going to get blooms faster from an existing spike, which makes logical sense, than from a brand new spike. Anyway, that's the snapped one, and this is the spike that is still going strong. So I am going to have some Phalaenopsis blooms later in the season, just not this one. They do last quite a long time in water though, so I am going to preserve it and we'll see how long it lasts. let's move you out of the way and look at your compatriot here. There we go. And this was the third plant that had the flower spike that had died that I cut off in the video because the flower spike had turned beige and was quite clearly dying. And as you can see, fabulous plant, fabulous roots, but not a sign of a spike. Curious, because they all have the same conditions. They all have the same light, the same water, they're all in the same medium. There you go. This one just decided not to bloom for me this season. And that's okay. Vegetative growth is the most important thing. This is a really serious flower. It's got so many dead spikes. I've had this one for quite some time. Maybe it's just decided to sit this year out, which might not be a bad idea. So that's my experiment. And because of that, I have decided to add some other subjects to our experimentation. Now, this one I recently bought from a supermarket because I'm a sucker for a sob story. I can't stand seeing Phalaenopsis withering and dehydrating in the terrible light of supermarkets. But this one had the most beautiful flowers, yellow with a really bright magenta center. Couldn't resist it. Anyway, the flowers are just about dead. The plant was just about dead. So I've repotted it, this time in terracotta with large bark and sphagnum moss. So different potting techniques that I've used with other ones, but you know, I'm up for the game. And you can see that it had 2 spikes. Now, the top half of this one naturally died down to this point. So again, plant lovers, and this other spike seems quite happily green as well. So my lesson is I'm just going to leave it and let it do what it wants to do. However, there is a little node just at the top here which looks like it's going to produce a spike. If nothing happens, and if these spikes just sit here for, let's say, another month and they don't do anything, but they're still green, I am going to cut them off because I feel they've lost their mojo. So that's that one. And lastly, this one. Isn't that the most sensational magenta color? Now, back in the day when we used to be able to have friends over, in between Melbourne's many lockdowns, we had a friend staying in the spare room, and I didn't really have an orchid in bloom at the time. I thought, I want something colorful for her in the bedroom. And so I went to the hardware store, and there was this beautiful magenta Phalaenopsis. Quite some time ago, because we've been in lockdown forever. So this is the last bloom. That one is just dead, it's on the turn. But plant lovers, what I noticed with delight and joy is that this one too has decided to spike from a node 2/3 of the way up the spike. And so the new me is obviously going to let it do what it wants to do. And the other thing I've realized too when my Phalaenopsis do this is that the remaining top half also doesn't die. So I'm not going to cut that, which I didn't do with the other one either. I will leave it if it's still green. But with this one, the spike did die for that top third and it became beige and it was very dead. So I did snip that off, and now we've still got the green part and the node up there, which looks like it's about to produce a secondary spike. So there we are, plant lovers. That is the outcome of our Phalaenopsis do I chop the spike or do I not experiment, which was brought to an untimely close by the vicious hands of someone, not a culture of blame, who will remain nameless, that wasn't me. I would never really have done this because I have always cut the spikes off regardless of what color they were the minute the flowers have died. So I don't think there is an absolute answer to this. I think it's really up to you and what you want. But because I like to go with the flow and listen to my plants, I'm going to let the orchids tell me what they want. So this one has decided to produce a secondary spike. It seems very happy. I'm going to let it do it. This one, this is a store rescue that wasn't in great condition. The plant might not have the energy and wherewithal to produce new flower spikes at the moment because it's been through trauma of a supermarket. So if that's the case, then I will chop these off and just let the plant recover before it decides to burst into bloom next season. But there we are, plant lovers. I hope that has been interesting, and I hope perhaps stimulated you to think about what to do with your spent orchids. So I think what we can assume is that there is no absolute answer. It isn't necessarily damaging to the plant to leave the spike to rebloom, and it also isn't damaging if you cut a dead spike off and allow the blooming process to start again each season. Although I will say that the only orchid that I trimmed, this one, decided not to bloom this year. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this. I certainly have, although, never mind, but I've now got a beautiful cut flower. I do post every week, so if you're interested in following my continuing adventures, do hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next week.